Chapter 1. The Unexpected Stop. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the skyline of Chicago, painting the evening sky with shades of gold and purple. The streets, once bustling with the energy of a busy city, were now growing quieter, as if the city itself was taking a breath after the rush of the day. The world outside Michael Thompson's car felt peaceful, the low hum of his engine and the soft music playing on a radio filling the air with a sense of calm. The 17-year-old had just finished a long day working part-time at a local grocery store, his worn sneakers resting lightly on the pedals as he made his way home. Michael's old sedan, a car he'd saved up for after months of working odd jobs, wasn't much to look at, but it was his. The interior smelled faintly of pine air freshener, and the seats had begun to wear down from the long hours he spent driving back and forth. But it was his car, and in that moment, it was his haven. He sighed deeply, leaning back against the seat, feeling the weight of the day lift as the miles rolled on. He glanced at the dashboard, noting the time. It would be a while before he got home, but that was okay. His mom would be waiting for him. She always worried when he stayed out too late, but she didn't understand how important it was to Michael to have those few quiet moments of peace. He couldn't wait to get back and sit at the dinner table with her, just the two of them. The street ahead stretched long and empty, the pavement stretching into the horizon, bathed in the last remnants of sunlight. As Michael adjusted his rearview mirror, he noticed a pair of headlights flickering in the distance, slowly getting closer. At first, he thought nothing of it, just another car on the road. But then, as the headlights grew nearer, the familiar red and blue flash of sirens lit up the rearview mirror, casting a cold, unnatural glow across the car's interior. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He checked the speedometer. He wasn't speeding. There were no signs of erratic driving. He had done nothing wrong. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel as he glanced back in the mirror at the police cruiser, now right behind him. It was a feeling he knew all too well, the sinking sensation in his gut whenever he encountered the police. "Just stay calm," he muttered to himself, the words barely above a whisper. His mom's voice echoed in his mind. "Always keep your hands where they can see them. Be polite. Don't make any sudden movements." He signaled to pull over to the side of the road, his car crunching against the gravel as he slowed to a stop. The patrol car followed, its lights still flashing aggressively, making the roadside look like a scene from a nightmare. Michael's hands instinctively placed themselves on the steering wheel, just like his mom had taught him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for the officer to approach. The door of the patrol car opened, and the first officer stepped out. He was tall, with a buzz cut, his face hidden behind dark sunglasses that mirrored Michael's nervous expression. Behind him, another officer stood by the car, his posture stiff, hands resting on his belt. Michael swallowed hard, tried to keep his calm. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He knew that, but something about the way the officers were looking at him made him feel like they were already accusing him of something. The first officer approached the car slowly, each step deliberate, as if he were walking into a situation he knew he could control. He stopped just a few feet from the driver's side window, tapping it with his knuckles in a rhythm that felt too loud in the quiet evening. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He rolled the window down, keeping his hands firmly on the wheel. "Good evening, officer," he said, trying to sound as calm as he could, but his voice betrayed him, cracking slightly. The officer didn't respond with the usual polite greetings he had seen in movies. Instead, his voice was cold, professional, almost mechanical. "License and registration," the officer demanded. Michael hesitated for a second before responding, trying to control his racing heart. "Yes, sir. It's in the glove compartment." He reached over slowly, making sure his movements were smooth, deliberate. The officer's gaze never left him. His partner stood behind the first officer, watching Michael with sharp, calculating eyes. "Is there a problem, officer?" Michael asked, his voice firm, though it didn't quite match the nervous flutter in his chest. The officer took Michael's license and registration from him without a word, holding them in his hand as he studied them for what felt like an eternity. Michael forced himself not to fidget. His mind raced. What did they want? What had he done? "You own this car?" the officer asked suddenly, his lips twitching into something that resembled a smirk. Michael nodded, though the question seemed odd to him. Yes, sir. The officer handed the papers to his partner without taking his eyes off Michael. Mind telling me where you're headed? Just heading home, Michael said, trying to sound casual. I'm just passing through. The officer didn't seem convinced. He motioned to his partner, who stepped forward and took Michael's license from the first officer. Step out of the car, the second officer said, his voice low but commanding. Michael's heart skipped a beat. Why? He asked, his voice shaky despite his best efforts to stay calm. I haven't done anything wrong. Step out of the car, the officer repeated, his tone hard. Michael swallowed his protests, taking a deep breath. He pushed open the door and stepped onto the gravel, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. He felt the weight of the officer's gaze on him as he stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening. The second officer moved in closer, scanning Michael from head to toe, his eyes lingering on Michael's clothes, his sneakers, the car he was driving. This is a pretty nice car for a student, the officer said, his tone dripping with skepticism. Michael clenched his jaw, biting back the response that nearly escaped him. I work part-time to pay for it, he said simply, his voice steady but firm. A student driving a car like this? The officer let out a short, mocking laugh, shaking his head. What do you do, sell drugs? Michael's fists clenched involuntarily. He had heard this kind of disbelief before. He knew the tone. It wasn't about the car. It wasn't about him at all. It was about his skin. He had seen stories like this play out on the news. He had heard the rumors from friends. But hearing it happen to him was different. No, sir, Michael replied, though his voice trembled ever so slightly. The officer's posture stiffened as he circled around Michael's car. Do you have any weapons in the car? He asked, his hand resting near his holster. No, Michael answered quickly, his eyes darting nervously between the officers. Drugs? Alcohol? The officer continued, pulling open the door and poking through the car. Hey, you can't do that, Michael protested, his voice rising. The officer ignored him, rifling through his belongings, pulling open the glove compartment and scattering its contents across the passenger seat. Michael felt the anger rise within him, but he kept his hands at his sides, afraid that any sudden movement might escalate things. The second officer stepped closer, his hand hovering near his gun. You need to calm down, kid, he said coldly. Michael's pulse raced. His thoughts were a blur as he reached into his pocket for his phone. He had to call his mom. He couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I'm calling my mom, he said, his voice shaking. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. Your mom? The first officer sneered. What's she going to do? I know my rights, Michael said, his voice steadying as he glanced at the officer. Oh, you know your rights, huh? The officer smirked, as if mocking him. Before Michael could respond, the second officer grabbed him by the arm and spun him around, forcing his hands behind his back. Hand behind your back, he barked. Michael's heart raced in his chest. I haven't done anything, he protested, but the officer didn't listen. With a swift movement, the officer snapped the handcuffs around his wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. Michael winced, his body tensing. This wasn't happening. Not to him. Suddenly, the sound of engines approached, growing louder and more distinct. Two black SUVs appeared in the distance, their tinted windows gleaming in the fading sunlight. The officers stopped in their tracks, their gazes shifting nervously toward the approaching vehicles. Chapter 2. Rising Tensions. The sound of the engines grew louder, and Michael's heart pounded even faster in his chest. As the two black SUVs approached, the officers glanced at each other, unease creeping into their stiff postures. The vehicle slowed and then pulled up to a stop, blocking the view of the patrol car. The sudden appearance of the SUVs seemed to rattle the officers, who instinctively stepped back. Michael's head was spinning. He had done everything right. He had kept his hands visible. He had been polite. He had followed the officers' commands, even when they didn't make sense. Yet here he was on the side of the road, handcuffed, the gravel digging into his cheek, his body stiff from the harsh treatment. The thought of what might happen next made his stomach twist in knots. The SUV doors opened in perfect synchronization, and men in dark suits stepped out, their eyes scanning the surroundings with practiced precision. Michael barely had a chance to catch his breath before the first figure emerged from the lead vehicle. His eyes locked onto Michael's immediately, and for a split second, everything seemed to freeze. It was Joe Biden. The former president stepped out of the SUV, his polished shoes clicking against the gravel as he moved toward the officers. His presence commanded the air around him, the authority in his every step undeniable. The officers, once so sure of themselves, now seemed like they were suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation. Their earlier confidence began to falter, their faces losing their rigidity as they exchanged uncertain glances. "Is everything all right here?" Biden asked, his voice calm yet firm as he approached the officers. His eyes scanned the scene, and they rested on Michael for a moment, the silent message in his gaze clear. "You're not alone." The taller officer, still trying to maintain some semblance of control, stepped forward. "Sir, this is a routine traffic stop. We have everything under control." Biden didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on Michael, his concern still visible. "Routine, huh?" he asked, his voice steady, but with an edge. "I don't see a reason for this young man to be lying on the ground in handcuffs." The officers exchanged looks, but no one spoke. Biden took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. "What's his crime?" he asked, his voice softer now, but still carrying an undeniable weight. The officers remained silent, clearly unsure of how to answer. "Answer the man." One of Biden's security agents barked, their tone giving away that they had no intention of letting this slide. The taller officer hesitated. "Well, he was acting suspicious. We thought the vehicle might be stolen." "Suspicious based on what?" Biden asked, his brow furrowing in disbelief. The officer paused, clearly uncomfortable under Biden's steady gaze. "It's a high-value vehicle," he muttered. "We had reason to believe." Before he could finish, Biden interrupted him. "You had reason to believe?" He took another step forward, his eyes now piercing. "Are you telling me you pulled him over just because you thought he shouldn't be driving a nice car?" The silence that followed was deafening. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado evaporating under Biden's scrutiny. Michael, still lying on the ground, felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he tried to keep his emotions in check. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he felt seen. Someone believed him. He wasn't just a suspect. He wasn't just a threat. He was a person. Biden's gaze turned back to Michael, softer now. "Are you okay, son?" Michael's throat tightened as he looked up at the former president. "Yes, sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but steady. His heart was still pounding in his chest, but now it was a different kind of pounding, a pounding of hope, of gratitude. He nodded slowly, fighting the urge to break down. "I am okay." Biden gave him a small nod, his face softening slightly. He turned back to the officers, his expression hardening once again. "Take those cuffs off him." "Now." The officers hesitated for a moment, exchanging a glance, but it didn't take long before the second officer reluctantly stepped forward. He pulled the key from his belt and unlocked the cuffs with a sharp click. As soon as they were off, Michael rubbed his sore wrists, wincing slightly at the tenderness. One of Biden's security agents moved quickly to Michael's side, offering him a bottle of water. Michael took it with trembling hands, his fingers still shaking from the shock of the whole situation. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Biden watched the exchange, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to the officers. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. The officers stood there stiffly, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to speak. Biden raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. "What's your name?" he asked, looking at the taller officer. "Officer Grant," the man replied, his voice clipped and defensive. Biden's eyes shifted to the shorter officer. "And yours?" "Officer Daniels," he muttered. Biden nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice suddenly quieter, but filled with authority. Both officers stiffened, nodding quickly. "Yes, sir," they said in unison, their voices tight. Biden took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as he folded his arms across his chest. "Then you should know that what I just witnessed is unacceptable," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You humiliated that boy. You profiled him. You treated him like a criminal without any evidence to back it up. That's not policing. That's abuse of power." Officer Grant opened his mouth as if to protest, but Biden held up a hand. "I'm not interested in your excuses. I'm interested in accountability." The officers fell silent. Biden's gaze turned to Michael for a moment before he spoke again, this time addressing the officers with a cold, calculated finality. "I want her badge numbers, and I want to know the name of your supervisor." Now, Grant and Daniels both hesitated, the weight of the former president's words sinking in. Slowly, Daniels pulled out a notepad and scribbled down the information, handing it over to one of Biden's security agents. "Good," Biden said. "Make sure this gets reported. I want a full investigation, and I want consequences for what I just saw." Michael, still standing off to the side, felt his pulse slowly begin to steady as Biden turned back to him. "You all right, son?" he asked, his voice soft. Michael nodded again, his throat tight. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Biden smiled faintly. "Good. Take care of yourself, all right." His gaze turned back to the officers one last time. "You too. You're done here. Go back to your precinct and explain to your supervisor why you're being reported." The officers, their heads down, slowly retreated to their patrol car, neither daring to look back as they climbed inside. The patrol car revved its engine, and with the soft squeal of tires, it sped off into the distance, leaving Michael with a newfound sense of calm and a firm resolve that things were about to change. Chapter 3. The Unexpected Intervention. The silence in the air was palpable as the officers stood, stiff and uncertain, while the two black SUVs blocked the patrol car from view. Michael could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he allowed himself a small sigh of relief. He wasn't sure what was happening, but the sudden appearance of these vehicles, along with the authority that followed, felt like a lifeline thrown into the chaos. He glanced up at Joe Biden, still standing just a few feet away. The former president's calm presence seemed to make everything else fade into the background. Biden's gaze was intense as it flicked between the two officers and Michael. Reading the situation in the same quiet way, he carried himself, sure of what was right, certain of what needed to be done. The officers, still flustered, exchanged quick glances before the taller one spoke up, his voice forced and tight. "Sir, this is a routine traffic stop. Everything's under control." Michael could almost hear the nervous tremor in the officer's voice, though he did his best to maintain his rigid stance. Biden didn't react immediately. Instead, he shifted his weight and moved slightly closer, his shoes crunching against the gravel, the movement slow but deliberate. "Routine, huh?" Biden's voice was calm, but there was an undeniable firmness in it. "I don't see how throwing a young man to the ground in cuffs is considered routine." The officers stood there, mouths agape, stunned by the straightforward challenge. The air seemed to thicken. The sharp sting of the evening's tension hung like a dark cloud. They hadn't expected this, a quiet confrontation of this magnitude. Biden continued, his eyes locked on the officers, as if reading the very truth behind their actions. "What's his crime?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying a subtle weight of authority. "You know, I don't see one." The second officer, Officer Daniels, opened his mouth to answer, but the words never quite formed. They remained trapped in his throat, his confidence deflating as the silence stretched. His eyes darted from Biden to his partner, both of them unsure how to proceed. The taller officer, Officer Grant, finally spoke up, trying to salvage what little control he had left. "Sir, he was acting suspicious. We had reason to believe the vehicle might be stolen." Biden's eyebrows rose. He took a slow step forward, narrowing his eyes at the officer, a flicker of disbelief flashing in his gaze. "Suspicious? Based on what?" The officer's response was hesitant, barely above a murmur. "It's a high-value car, and is that your justification?" Biden cut him off, his tone icy. "So, a young man driving a nice car is a reason to suspect him of theft?" He looked at Michael, who stood there, still shaken, but somehow grounding himself in the midst of the storm. You're telling me this boy is a criminal just because he's driving a car that you think is too nice for him? The officers froze. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Michael's heart beat louder now, but not from fear. For the first time in what felt like hours, he felt a spark of something else, something close to hope. Biden turned to face Michael then, his voice gentler as he addressed him directly. "Are you okay, son?" Michael swallowed, his throat dry, but he nodded, more steady than before. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice low but calm. He knew he was okay now, not just because Biden was there, but because for the first time, someone powerful had seen him for who he truly was. Not as a suspect, not as a problem, just as a kid trying to get home. Biden's eyes softened for a moment as he gave Michael a brief nod of reassurance before he faced the officers again. "Take those cuffs off him," he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable command. Officer Grant hesitated, his hand moving instinctively to his belt where the key to the handcuffs rested. His face was flushed now, his arrogance completely stripped away in the face of Biden's scrutiny. Slowly, he approached Michael and unlocked the cuffs, the cold metal snapping away from Michael's wrists with an abruptness that made him wince. Michael's hands shook slightly as he rubbed his wrists, the skin still raw and tender from the pressure. It wasn't just the pain, though. It was the relief. The feeling of being seen, of having someone with the power to make the situation right stand up for him when no one else had. Biden watched the entire interaction closely, his gaze unreadable but focused. Without missing a beat, he turned to one of his security agents and nodded. "Get this young man some water," he said. One of the agents quickly retrieved a bottle of water from the SUV and handed it to Michael. "Here you go," the agent said with a soft smile. Michael took the water gratefully, his hands still trembling as he unscrewed the cap. "Thank you," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible, but filled with a quiet gratitude that went beyond the simple act of giving him a drink. Biden, who had been observing the scene with a sharp eye, took a step back, folding his arms across his chest. He looked at the officers, his expression hardening once more. "You too. What's your name?" he asked, focusing first on Officer Grant. "Officer Grant," the officer muttered stiffly, as though it was painful to even say. "And you?" Biden asked, turning his attention to the shorter officer. "Officer Daniels," the man replied, his voice barely a whisper. Biden nodded once, his face set in a hard line. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice low but carrying a clear authority. Both officers nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Yes, sir," they said in unison, their voices filled with a mix of respect and uncertainty. Biden stood tall, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Then you should know that what I just saw is unacceptable. You humiliated that boy. You profiled him. You treated him like a criminal without a single shred of evidence to support it. That's not policing. That's abuse of power." Officer Grant opened his mouth to respond, but Biden cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I don't want to hear excuses," he said, his voice cold. "I want accountability. I want your badge numbers, and I want the name of your supervisor." The officers exchanged looks, both of them visibly uncomfortable now. Officer Daniels pulled out his notepad, his hand shaking slightly as he scribbled down the information. He handed the note to one of Biden's agents, who immediately stepped away to ensure the proper authorities would receive it. Biden's gaze turned back to Michael for a moment, softer this time. "You okay?" he asked again, his voice quieter now. Michael nodded, the words almost stuck in his throat. For the first time in a long time, he felt heard. "Yes, sir," he said, a small but sincere smile breaking through the tension in his face. Biden smiled back, but it was brief, purposeful. "Good. Take care of yourself. And if you need anything, you know who to call." His tone, though still authoritative, carried a sense of genuine concern. As Biden turned his attention back to the officers, Michael took a deep breath, finally allowing himself to relax just a little. The relief was overwhelming. It wasn't just about the cuffs coming off or the officers being held accountable. It was about the sense that, for once, he wasn't just a statistic in a headline. He was a person who mattered. Biden watched as the officers, defeated, made their way back to their patrol car. They didn't look back as they got in and drove off, their taillights disappearing into the distance. Michael remained where he stood, his heart still racing, but now for an entirely different reason. A surge of something like hope stirred inside him. Hope that maybe things could be different. Maybe, just maybe, the world was starting to see the injustice that had been happening for so long. As Biden's SUVs began to move again, Michael felt something shift. A sense of finality. A sense of closure. And for the first time in hours, he felt a flicker of hope for the future. Chapter 4. The Public Outcry. The days that followed the encounter on the side of the road were a whirlwind for Michael. The events of that evening seemed almost surreal now, like something out of a movie. But there was nothing fictional about it. The moment the SUVs had pulled up and Joe Biden stepped out, everything had shifted. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with clips of Biden confronting the officers, his calm demeanor cutting through the tension of the scene. Videos of the event circulated on every platform: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, each post reaching thousands, then millions of people. People shared their outrage, their support, and their own stories of similar injustices. Michael, who had just been trying to get home that night, was suddenly at the center of a national conversation about racial profiling, police brutality, and the power dynamics between law enforcement and marginalized communities. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a story that belonged to everyone who had ever been mistreated or misunderstood because of the color of their skin. His phone never stopped buzzing. It was as if the entire world had heard his name, and now they were demanding to hear more. Texts from friends, messages from strangers, notifications from news outlets. It was overwhelming. But among all the messages of support, there were also those who didn't understand, who questioned the whole situation, who saw the intervention as nothing more than a political stunt. The criticisms hurt, but they didn't break him. Michael knew that this was bigger than just him, that this conversation needed to be had. And despite the negativity, the support from people who had been through similar struggles fueled him. One evening, as Michael sat in the living room of his modest home, scrolling through the endless stream of messages on his phone, his mother came into the room. She had been quiet for the past few days, her worry palpable. But now, as she stood there looking at her son, there was a sense of pride in her eyes. "They're talking about you on the news," she said softly, a note of disbelief in her voice. "People are calling you brave." Michael didn't look up from his phone at first. The words didn't quite register. "I didn't do anything brave," he muttered. "I was just trying to get home." His mother took a seat beside him, her expression softening as she reached out and placed a hand on his. "You stood your ground, Michael," she said. "You didn't let them break you. You kept calm, even when they didn't deserve it. That's courage." Michael swallowed, tried to push back the emotions that were starting to build up. It was hard to grasp that what had happened to him was now part of a much bigger story. But his mom was right. He had kept calm. He had stood his ground. He thought back to the moment when Biden had stepped out of the SUV, when everything had seemed to stop for just a moment. That was when it had all changed. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just another young man of color pulled over for no reason. He was seen. And in that moment, he knew that if someone like Biden, someone with the power to make a difference, was willing to step in, then maybe the world could change. Later that evening, as Michael continued to scroll through the flood of messages, he saw something that made his stomach twist. It was a post on social media, shared by someone he didn't recognize. The post was critical, accusing him of using his situation to gain attention, calling him a victim who had been playing the race card. Michael's fingers tightened around the phone as he read the words again, trying to make sense of them. "They don't get it," he muttered, shaking his head. His mother, who had been standing nearby, overheard him and walked over to sit next to him. "Don't focus on the negative, baby," she said gently. "There will always be people who don't understand. But for every person who criticizes you, there are 10 who are thankful for your bravery. You gave people a voice." Michael stared at the post for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing. He knew his mom was right. He couldn't let the criticism get to him. There were too many people out there who needed to hear his story, who needed to see someone stand up. "Mom," he said after a moment, his voice quieter than before. I think I need to do more." I can't just sit here and do nothing." His mother smiled softly, her eyes glistening with pride. "I think you're right, but you'll know when the time is right. Your voice has already made a difference. Don't rush it." Later that night, Michael received a call that made his heart jump into his throat. The screen of his phone lit up, displaying an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, Michael," came the voice on the other end, calm and authoritative. "This is Joe Biden." Michael froze, unsure whether he was dreaming. "Mr. Biden?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying his disbelief. "That's right," Biden replied. "I just wanted to check in on you, see how you're holding up. I know it's a lot to process." Michael couldn't quite believe it. I'm okay, sir," he stammered. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Biden's voice softened slightly. "You don't have to thank me. I did what anyone would have done. But I want you to remember something. This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's ever been in your position. Everyone who's been pulled over for no reason, who's been profiled, treated like a criminal because of the color of their skin. This is bigger than you and me, and you have a chance to make sure it doesn't get swept under the rug." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat as Biden's words sank in. It wasn't just his experience anymore. He was part of a movement. His story wasn't just his own. It belonged to anyone who had ever been wronged by a system that didn't see them as equal. "You've got a voice now, Michael," Biden continued, "and people are listening. You can keep pushing for change. You can make sure this isn't the last time something like this happens." Michael took a deep breath. "I understand. I won't let it fade away." "Good," Biden said firmly. "And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Keep speaking the truth. People are listening." The call ended, and Michael sat there for a moment, his hand still gripping the phone, the weight of Biden's words hanging in the air. For the first time since the traffic stop, he felt something deeper than just the relief of being safe. He felt responsibility. He felt a sense of purpose. As he looked out the window at the quiet streets of his neighborhood, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been held down or silenced by a system that didn't care about them. And with that, the next chapter of his journey had begun. Chapter 5, A Call for Change. The days following Michael's conversation with Joe Biden were a blur. The attention surrounding the incident only grew stronger as more news outlets picked up the story. Headlines flooded across television screens, websites, and social media platforms, calling out the actions of the officers involved and praising Biden's intervention. The media was abuzz, but amidst the noise, Michael began to find his footing. He wasn't just a subject of discussion anymore. He was a voice in a much larger conversation. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Strangers would stop him on the street, their faces filled with gratitude and respect. Some offered their own stories of being mistreated by police. Others simply said, "Thank you." But with the praise came an undeniable weight, a responsibility he hadn't fully understood until now. Michael was no longer just a teenager trying to make his way home. He was a symbol of something much larger, a young man who, despite the odds, had stood up to an unjust system, and in doing so, had sparked a movement. One afternoon, Michael sat in his room, scrolling through the endless messages that had piled up on his phone. Each new notification brought a mixture of emotions, gratefulness, disbelief, but also a sense of overwhelming pressure. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked for the spotlight. But now that it was on him, he knew he couldn't just walk away. He set the phone down on his bed and looked out the window, watching the world move in slow motion outside. His thoughts drifted back to that night, the night everything had changed. He thought about the officers, their smug attitudes, their refusal to see him as human. He thought about Biden's arrival, how his presence had shifted everything. But most of all, Michael thought about the people who had been through what he had, the ones who hadn't had a Joe Biden to step in for them, the ones who hadn't been lucky enough to walk away. His phone buzzed on the bed beside him, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up and saw that it was a message from his mother. She had been worried, as usual, but over the last few days, there was a new glimmer of pride in her words. "Michael, I think it's time. You've been through a lot, but you've also opened a door for so many others. You have the power to make a real difference. Don't let go to waste." Michael read the message again. His mother had always been supportive, but this felt different. There was a shift in her, a sense of belief in something bigger. He had always known his mother loved him, but now she was seeing him differently. She was seeing him as more than just her son. She was seeing him as someone capable of bringing change to the world. He sat back on the bed, his mind racing. Could he really make a difference? He wasn't sure. He wasn't sure about anything anymore. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just sit back and let things go back to the way they were. That evening, Michael received another call from Joe Biden. This time, the conversation was different. It wasn't just a check-in. Biden was calling to discuss the next steps. "Michael," Biden began, his voice as steady as ever, "I've been following everything. You got people talking, and that's exactly what we need right now. People are paying attention." Michael took a deep breath, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this," he said, his voice hesitant. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to go home that night." "I know you didn't," Biden replied, "but now you have a platform. And with that platform comes responsibility. You've already made a difference, Michael. But this is just the beginning." Michael shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of Biden's words settle over him. "What do you mean?" "I'm pushing for reforms," Biden said. "There's a real chance to make some changes in how we approach policing. But I need people like you, people who've been through this firsthand, to help push it forward. We need your voice. The country needs your voice." Michael swallowed hard, the weight of Biden's words sinking in. He wasn't just being asked to speak out. He was being asked to help change the system. He felt a mix of fear and determination rise in his chest. Was he really ready for this? "You're stronger than you think," Biden continued. "And don't forget, this isn't just about you. This is about everyone who's been pulled over for no reason, about every person who's been humiliated by the system. We have a chance to change things, Michael. But it won't happen if we stay silent." Michael's mind raced. He thought about everything he had been through, the fear, the anger, the helplessness. He thought about all the people he had met in the past few days, strangers who had shared their own stories with him, people who had lived through what he had and worse. "I'll do it," Michael said, the words leaving his mouth before he had time to reconsider. "I'll speak out." Biden's voice softened, and for the first time, Michael heard a hint of pride in it. "Good. I knew you would. And remember, you're not alone in this. We're all behind you." The conversation ended, but Michael didn't put the phone down right away. He sat there, staring at the screen as a sense of purpose filled him. He had agreed to take on something bigger than he ever thought possible, but he felt ready. He had to be. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, press conferences, and interviews. Michael was speaking at community events, joining protests, and even testifying before a congressional committee on police reform. Everywhere he went, people listened. His words carried weight. People were no longer looking at him just as a victim. They were looking at him as a leader. One morning, as he prepared for another interview, Michael received a message from one of Biden's aides. "We're pushing for real reform. Your testimony today could be the catalyst we need. You've got the power to make change. Don't hold back." Michael read the message several times. His testimony wasn't just about his story anymore. It was about the future. It was about making sure that people like him, people who had been overlooked, profiled, and mistreated, didn't have to go through what he had. He arrived at the event that day, the air charged with anticipation. He stepped onto the stage, the bright lights blinding him for a moment. The room was packed with journalists, lawmakers, and activists. The weight of the moment hit him as he took the microphone. "My name is Michael Thompson," he began, his voice clear and steady. "And a few weeks ago, I was just driving home. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But the police pulled me over. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a threat." The room fell silent, hanging on every word. "They didn't ask me if I was okay," Michael continued. "They didn't ask me why I was driving a nice car. They didn't see a young man just trying to get home. They saw something else. And that's a problem. But it's not just my problem. It's a problem for anyone who looks like me, who's ever been treated like a criminal for no reason other than their skin color." Michael paused, letting the gravity of his words settle over the room. "We need to change this. We need to make sure that no one ever has to go through what I did. And we need to make sure that the people who are supposed to protect us are held accountable for their actions. The audience erupted into applause, and Michael felt a sense of pride swell within him. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was everyone's story. As he left the stage, Michael felt the weight of the responsibility still heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be.
If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us and motivates us to continue sharing heartwarming, inspiring stories almost every day.